we're going to look at 4 different ways of answering that question. Should the same principles that apply domestically also govern relations between societies globally? We're going to look at 4 different ways of looking at this. So let me just give you a typology very quickly. Here's a line. Over here, we're going to put realism. And realism is going to answer this question. Let me just show you here. Moral principles that apply domestically do not apply in IR, which again is not a big surprise if you think about realism, how a realist would answer that question. Should the same principles that apply domestically also govern relations between societies globally? No, it's a zombie apocalypse. Every person for themselves, right? You got to the only thing that's going to help you survive is yourself, self-help. Everybody else is on their own. So realism is going to answer that question. Should they? And the answer is none. None of those things that apply domestically, the moral principles that apply domestically, should apply in IR. Let me just throw this down here for you before we go back to realism. Over here, we're going to have cosmopolitanism. And this is going to say all. Like there should be no distinction between domestic moral principles, what we owe to each other domestically, and what we owe to each other internationally. And then in between, we're going to look at 2 other perspectives. We're going to look here at moderate nationalism and moderate cosmopolitanism, which, to be honest with you, I know there's some people in here who call themselves realists. If I pushed you really hard on it, it would be hard for you. It may be hard, not for all of you, but for some of you, to sort of take this strong of a position way over here on this side. Those of you who feel yourselves like you like the cosmopolitanized idea, this is pretty strong over here as well. We're probably somewhere in between. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about the realism first. It's going to be the easiest one for us to wrap our heads around. A state's duty only comes from self-interest. Again, self-interest equals self-help. So when we talk about things like global justice, like what do we owe each other? Global justice is irrelevant for foreign policy. It doesn't matter what's right or wrong. It matters what you can do. Remember the Melian dialogue. The strong do what they can, the weak do what they must. It doesn't say the strong do what is morally important. They whatever they do, might makes right, sort of is the way to put this. Not about justice or anything like that. In IR, states are amoral. It doesn't mean they're immoral. It doesn't mean they act evilly. It just means questions about morality don't play a role for the realist. In anarchy, there is no good reason for a state to constrain its pursuit of self-interest. Because if you constrain your pursuit of self-interest, one of those other states is going to take advantage of it, and then you're not going to survive. So if you're not going to take care of yourself, nobody else is. So, how does the realist talk about international duties then? The duty of a state, in other words, the moral principles that the state should operate on in international relations, in the world, is to act in its own self-interest. That's it. In fact, if there's any moral principles that the state owes anyone, it owes it to its own citizens. And just think about this. Like we don't elect Donald Trump as president to then go out there and represent people from Bangladesh. We elect the president of the United States to represent the president of the United States. To the extent that he's no longer representing us, then he's not a very good president anymore. And so that's kind of the thing there. That sort of lines up kind of with the way we think about things. There are moral principles owed to its own citizens, again, domestically, but you don't owe anything to anybody else. In fact, if it will help you survive, you should do things that are maybe not even that great. Morality just doesn't play a role in this at all. Now, the realist is going to make this argument here that this is also good for humanity as a whole. This sounds like a very selfish argument right here. But the realist is going to say, hold on. That's in everybody's best interest. In the same way of capitalism. If everybody goes out into the marketplace and buys some things that they want, everybody's better off. That's the whole thing. That's how capitalism works. Similar to capitalism, if every person or state pursues its own interests, the common good is achieved. It's when other things start getting in the marketplace, according to capitalism, that kind of screws things up. So, for example, if every state is looking out for its own interests, the balance of power is going to emerge from that, and that's going to lead to peace. Remember the whole thing about realism. Another thing would be global trade will increase prosperity. Now, will it increase for everybody equally? No. It's not like that. But essentially, I mean, just because I go out in the marketplace and start spending doesn't mean that's going to make your life better or worse. But overall, the whole system should be better off. So, the conclusion the realist has is global order depends on states' pursuit of self-interest. So here's the tricky thing. If the United States starts to say, those people in Bangladesh are suffering, we have to go help them and save them, the realist is going to say, all this breaks down. All of a sudden, humanity is suffering in the same way that if the state intervenes in capitalism, the marketplace starts to break down. It just doesn't work. So stay in your lane is essentially the realist motto here. Stay in your lane. And your lane is your business. Take care of yourself. Let the Bangladeshi state take care of the Bangladeshis, and on and on and on. That's going to be perfect. That's how the system should work. You guys good with me on this? So that's realism. The next one over on our chain, so again, it's going to be this moderate nationalism, which is still going to lean towards the question again. Let me ask the question again. Should the same principles that apply domestically also govern relations between societies globally? And they're going to be much more on the side of no, but there are going to be some exceptions to that no. So some moral principles apply to IR, but most apply domestically only. So let me just talk about how it makes that distinction. The duties to co-nationals and foreigners, co-nationals just means people in my own state, they differ. So I owe general duties to all people. In other words, the moderate nationalist is going to say, look, the United States has a duty to not kill people in other states, to not try to eliminate Bangladesh, to not, probably, here's a big one, to not do a genocide, okay? The U.S. has a duty not to do a genocide, which is very different than the United States has a duty to feed the people of Bangladesh if they're hungry. That's not what it's saying. It's a very general duty, a very sort of broad thing. What do you owe a stranger you meet on the street? The very least that you owe this stranger you meet on the street, you don't owe them money, you don't owe them anything else, but you probably shouldn't shoot them in the face. That's essentially it. It's a very low bar, but it still is something, but it's not like I owe you everything. We owe special duties to our people. So there is a different set that we owe to us. And again, this is nationalism right there. And this is going to build off the argument we just talked about there, the efficiency argument that each state taking care of its own creates accountability and more needs get met. So if the United States government isn't doing its job, the United States people hold that government accountable. If the Bangladeshi government's not doing its job, the Bangladeshi people are supposed to hold that accountable. It's not up to the United States to hold the Bangladeshi government accountable. Because what happens is, if everybody's responsible for the Bangladeshi people, then the United States is going to say, oh, France will take care of it. And France will say, oh, Germany will take care of it. And Germany will say, oh, Japan will take care of it. And Japan will say, oh, the United States will take care of it, and nobody will take care of it. So we have a very clear thing with this argument here, this moderate nationalism, which says the people's own state has a responsibility to take care of those people, nationalism. It's no one else's responsibility to do that, and therefore we know who is responsible, who is accountable if something happens that doesn't line up with that. One version of this is something called liberal nationalism. The analogy is to duties owed to one's family. So I just want you to think about this for a second. Let's just, it's coronavirus time, all right? So let's imagine that one of your parents goes into the hospital with coronavirus and needs a ventilator. And let's imagine that some stranger goes in the hospital and needs the ventilator. There's only one ventilator. If you got to choose, who would you choose gets that ventilator? Your parent or the stranger? Not knowing anything else about the stranger, we would almost all say, if I got to choose, I'd probably choose my own parent. Is that immoral? Is that wrong to choose your own, I guess is the way to put that. And the answer is probably not. Like, we do have different feelings. We do feel like we owe different duties to our family members than to our friends, our neighbors, or to strangers. And this is the argument here, is it's the same analogy here, is the nation is your family and everybody else are acquaintances, strangers, so you owe them different things than you would owe your own family. We have a shared sense of membership. Remember, we talked about nationalism, the nation as an imagined community. So we imagine this thing, and it becomes real as a result. We have legal obligations to each other, right? We've signed this Constitution. We got this Constitution with each other, which says that we're kind of in this together. I haven't signed that same Constitution with Paraguay, right? I'm not in this together. I don't have my name. I mean, I don't really have, but as a citizen of the United States, I kind of have signed on the dotted line that I'm in on this. I haven't done that with Paraguay, so I don't owe them the same legal obligations. When our needs are met, we can help others with their needs. So once we're taken care of, once my family, again, stick with that analogy, once my family's okay, now my family can go out there and say, okay, let's help the homeless in our area. Let's help our neighbors who are having trouble. But if we're having trouble, we should be focused on sort of fixing our problems and not sort of looking around to see who else we can help. But once we're set, we can go help others. So some cooperation is important. So, for example, Israel's priority must be Israelis. And once those needs are met, then they can help the Palestinians. Israel's going to make this argument that until Israeli citizens feel safe, I don't know that I really should be spending a lot of money on helping the Palestinians have better water, have better health care, things like that. Once our people are safe, then we can focus on that. So it's the importance of protecting who makes up the we. It's really important then who is in your family and who's not in your family and how you get in the family, and all those sorts of questions become a really big part of this, thus all the conversations about immigration. And so essentially what it is there's nothing inherently unjust about international inequalities. Look around your neighborhood. Your family either has more or less than the family next door, or the family next door, family next door. Just because you have a little bit more than the family next door, or they have a little bit more than you, doesn't mean the system's unjust. It just means situations have affected you differently. So if Bangladesh is poor and the United States is weak, and this goes against the Peter Singer argument, if Bangladesh is poor and the United States is rich, there's nothing inherently unjust about that. It may be that once the United States has its act together, it can go help out Bangladesh, but there's no moral obligation to do that. All right, so that's liberal nationalism. I know this is going to go on a little bit longer. I only have 2 more slides because I want to talk about the other 2 things before we sort of close off here. So you got these 2 ideas. You got realism, you got moderate nationalism. Now let's go to the far end. So again, the question is, should the same principles that apply domestically also govern relations between societies globally? And the cosmopolitan, the strong cosmopolitan, is going to say, all the moral principles that apply domestically also apply in IR. I don't know why. I mean, again, this is, if you want to go sort of very, very strong on this, it would be sort of the Good Samaritan principle, that just because the person's a Samaritan doesn't mean you don't have obligations to this person. The duties to others depends on their humanness, not on nationality or anything else. This is kind of how we talk about human rights to some degree. That I owe the person in Bangladesh because we're humans, not because they're Bangladeshi and I'm on the US team, and therefore because you're on a different team, I owe you different things. We're all on the same team called humanity. Just because we pretended, again, imagine communities, pretended to split up into nations doesn't mean that's a real thing that should override the morality. So strong cosmopolitanism, I was saying, this sort of very, very extreme version of this. National borders and nation states should be eliminated. They are unjust, or at the very least, they create unjust conditions. If you look at the border between the United States and Mexico, so here's US, here's Mexico, and what you'll see is that, for example, the standard of living, the average income here is higher than down here. And why is that the case? It's the case because of this line that we've drawn right here. Well, this is inherently unjust because of this line. It's a structural thing that we've set up for these guys to protect their stuff. And so this should be got away because I'm not an American and they're not a Mexican. We are human beings. So why set up this artificial line? racism this extreme version would actually make the argument that realism and moderate nationalism might be racist or at least xenophobic, in the sense of, well, they're different from us based on what? Based on their nationality, which is often based on race. And so they get different things because they're not from our race. Now, it's not hardcore like this. We might also sort of make this argument, which is just fear of the other. I know my people, I don't know you guys, so I owe you guys different things. Okay, that's strong cosmopolitanism. That's a real tough position to take. But here's a more easy one to swallow: moderate cosmopolitanism. And it essentially says, not that, let me go back a second here. Maybe. I don't know how to go back. There we go. Not that all moral principles that apply domestically also apply in IR, but most do, is essentially what the moderate cosmopolitan will argue. And so international institutions should be strengthened. Maybe we're not there. We are divided up into nations, but that's kind of an artificial thing. So maybe there are things we can do. So we should, for example, strengthen the UN so that the UN can step in when Bangladeshis are starving to death. It may not be the U.S. that does it, but the U.S. participating in the UN then goes, so we as a community come together to help out the people in need. Loyalty to one's nation is okay, but it must not override the demands of global justice. Is that there is moral requirements that we have towards each other. That if, and this kind of goes back to the Peter Singer argument, that if Bangladesh has nothing and the United States has more than enough stuff, and helping Bangladesh out doesn't harm the United States in any way, then it's wrong for the United States not to help out. That's the sort of idea there. There are way more duties than put forward by moderate nationalism. So again, it's just sort of along the lines of that thing. So for example, things like human rights must be protected. Like responsibility to protect is a possibility. Responsibility to not harm others should be interpreted more broadly. It shouldn't just be that because we're not actively blowing up Bangladesh that we are meeting our duties to Bangladesh, but by withholding help that we could give without much cost to us, that we are actually harming Bangladesh. That's the sort of argument there. I'm going to skip over this next thing. Don't worry about this. I just want to get to the last question. Again, ignore all this, blah, blah, blah. I just want to go back to this question. What obligations do we owe our neighbors? This is a good question to sort of end a class on international relations with. What obligations do we owe each other? Not just, is it nice for us to send them some military aid or some humanitarian aid, or to come, there's a natural disaster, so we send some, we send some medical supplies down there. But do we owe our neighbors anything? And what obligations do we owe our neighbors? How does that work out? And I'm asking this both as an academic, right? We're studying this stuff. Some of you are going to go into this sort of field. What's the answer to that from that sort of academic standpoint? How would you answer that as a Christian? We're Christian, we're going into this. Like, is there a Christian answer to this? Or is that all just kind of hooey? Not that Christianity is hooey, but that Christianity maybe doesn't apply in this case? Or that to say there is one Christian answer is not exactly a good way to think about it? I don't know. And then finally, what does it mean as a human being? I know that you can see things through the lens of your nation. That's how we're trained to do things. But as a human being, is that an okay way to do things, or should it be something else? So I think it's something to sort of consider, and that's it. So I'll come back with a soapbox here in a little bit.